Okay, hey there, everybody. Welcome to week 7. Wow, we just have one more week together, which is really exciting. I hope wherever you are warm and you are well. I can say I'm here in my bedroom and I'm really cold. I've got on an extra sweater, got my shirt all the way buttoned up, got a warm mug of tea here. But no matter what, I'm still a little chilly. So, pause to take a little sip while it's still hot. And then let's look at what we have to do this week. I want to give you a couple of tips, just because we're going to look at a different type of lens this week. We're going to talk about a feminist critical lens that we can apply to work. Um, and then also discuss, a really important peer review step um, for your final essay. So let's go ahead and jump into it. And oop, there we go. So this is what you see. We are getting into the early novel. And you can see here there are quite a few graded assignments this week. So we've got a couple of quizzes, and then we have a couple of discussions because we've got one related to the novel, which is what we're going to be looking at this week. That new literary mode that started in the 11th, 12th century. Uh, didn't wasn't very popular for a long time and then became more popular later. And then, of course, the what we call the novel starts to exist in the 1800s or so. Um, and then we have our peer review discussion. So that's work that you've been working on already that you've posted ideally at the end of this past week. So if you haven't submitted your rough draft or at least the first few hundred words of your essay for the final essay in the course, you want to do that as soon as you can. Try to do that today. I'm recording this on Tuesday. I'm going to assume many of us aren't going to complete this our peer review steps until later. Note that February 23rd date is for your initial post, not for your response posts. So let's look and break down a couple of things really quickly. So when we look at our checklist this week, you can see for the read and annotate space, it's giving us a really high number this week of 6 to 8 hours. And that's because we have a big chunk of a text called Don Quixote. And I don't expect you to spend a full 6 hours on this, but I think you should probably give yourself at least a solid 3 to 4 hours of time as you think about what time you'll need to move through some of the reading and writing this week. But bank up to 8 hours if you can, just because you might want to spend more time with any particular item on our learning materials page. So, what are our learning materials this week, and which should you pay extra close attention to? Well, for our one of our quizzes is a character analysis quiz. So you should absolutely review literary character analysis to consider what we want to ask in whenever we're thinking about analyzing a character. And then we have another quiz related to Don Quixote, and we don't have the entire Don Quixote novel within our textbook for you to read, but we do have the front bit, and we do have a good chunk of that particular novel for us to read. You can see here it says 120 total pages. So that's where the bulk of the reading time comes through this week. A Book of Ladies, which will help us as we think about some of our feminist criticism, is 25 total pages. So here you can expect to spend roughly 45 minutes or so reading through this material, an hour or so if you're annotating, and we should try to be in the process of continually annotating, reading for a few pages, pausing, writing a sentence or two to summarize what we've just read. Helps us remember what we've just read, and we don't have time to reread a lot of things, so that's why we do that. Um, and then a couple of hours of reading here for Don Quixote. Maybe some of you have read Don Quixote in the past. It's one of the more famous pieces of literature that exists in the Western world. But if you haven't, well, you're in for a little bit of a treat. It's one of my favorite novels that I have not read entirely, reread entirely, gosh, for probably approaching 20 years now, which is wild. So it's always a reminder to me that, oh, I need to go back and just reread that book sometime. But okay, so there's our focus, and there's a reminder of how these learning materials connect with some of your core assignments this week. And now let's talk about feminist criticism and applying that approach to our to a text, because whenever we get into this feminist mode here with a feminist analysis, your instructions, okay, are to apply a feminist lens to a particular text. And you can see here that we can apply the information from the feminist criticism to the Book of Ladies or to other literature reading from this week. So to Don Quixote, if you wanted to attempt that. Um, Most of us will end up choosing this, and that's fine. And then we're going to work to analyze that story through a feminist lens, thinking about how do certain areas of the text, how can we look at those through and make some claims about them in relation to gender, power dynamics, so power dynamics between men and women in particular, and then the way individuals or groups are described. So how are men described? How are women described? That's a core question within feminist criticism. It's looking at, if we look at this text through the lens, right? If we hold this lens up to it, and that lens filters for us a direction on uh, how women are handled within the writing, what might that reveal? What claims might that allow us to make about that text, about that writing? That's what feminist criticism thinks about and what it works to try to argue whenever scholars apply a feminist lens to their literary analysis. And you'll remember that literary analysis is just various ways. We have all sorts of different lenses we can choose: biographical, right, historical, feminist, Marxist. Um, Reader response. We're putting those over a text to help us narrow what it is we want to argue about and write about, because writing is hard. Writing is thinking, and thinking is difficult, and we have to think, and we have to put that on the page. So it's just, hey, how can I, narrow what I want to write about through a particular lens and use that to help me guide what evidence I want to pull into the writing that I want to accomplish. And so that's what we're practicing this week. That's the big piece for us to apply a new lens. And this might also mean for some of you who, since we're just getting to this particular lens, or a greater focus on it in this part of the semester, and students in the past sometimes have asked, hey, Professor Betts, I actually want to revise my current draft, and I want to use a feminist lens. I want to produce some feminist criticism on a particular text. Can I do that? And you absolutely can. It might mean you're going to need to revise and rewrite some things more intently than others who are choosing different lenses in order to produce their final essay, but you could do that if you wanted to. But please let me know if you do that, just because I will be working to provide you with some feedback on your first few hundred words of your final essay this week. And if you're going to radically change things, then I would like you to give me a more current version of your writing, so that way I can give you more specific advice on how to move forward with drafting that text. Okay, so that said, going into the last thing I want to note here into our peer review space. So remember that when it comes to peer review, right, which will be due, the reply post due next Monday, you're looking at of your peers, um, two peer essay drafts. And if for some reason someone shared something that you can't access, please let them know that by replying to their post. And then you have some questions here to help you move through that response. Okay, so this is what I want you to use. You're not an English professor yet. Maybe some of you will be one day. And so no one should expect to provide English professor-like insight into the peers' work. But these should be some questions that can help drive your response. And they're often the questions that I'm asking. I just do this more often so I can articulate things sometimes more clearly or see things more quickly. That's really the only difference between us, is I just do this a lot more than you, because writing is a skill, reading is a skill. And because of that, I mean, the more you do it, the better you get at it, right? So that's the difference. but that doesn't mean that you can't provide good feedback. So use these questions to help guide your feedback and try your best to, approach your peers' work with care and consideration. And then, and here's the trick with peer review, try to apply these same questions to your own writing. That's the real trick. So the strongest writers are those who develop their own self-revision and self-editing skills, and that's what we develop over time. Of course, it's always going to be helpful when we have someone else look at our work and give us feedback, but the more we can look at our own writing objectively and ask questions of it and try to create answers to those questions, the stronger our drafts become without the need of someone else looking at our writing. The last thing that I'll note here, and then I'll end this video, relates to some free online tutoring for writing. It has an online writing lab through BrainFuse. I strongly, strongly recommend receiving some feedback from these folks. In some classes, in my English 111 class, I require all students to receive outside feedback before they submit final drafts. I don't require that in my 200 level courses, but it's something that if I were in your shoes and I had access to a free online, low stakes way to receive feedback on my writing before I turn in the biggest assignment of the semester, I would absolutely use it. So um, consider that resource. Don't forget about it. Many students do. And it's only going to give you more things to think about and more things to help you. The only caveat I can give is that you just want to make sure that you give them access to the assignment sheet or let them know what the goal of the assignment is. So that way they don't tell you to do the wrong thing, right? That's the only potential risk, but we mitigate that risk by just giving them the assignment sheet or showing them. And then they know, oh, okay, this is what the professor's asking for. This is what that assignment is wanting them to do. So I can now give you some additional feedback to help you meet that goal. Okay, stop share. Back here. Thank you for all of your work. Let me know if you have any questions about anything I've recently graded or commented on. Let me know if you have any questions about any work that you have going on this week. I will check back in later this week, usually on Fridays, but this past week on Sunday, just to remind you about Monday deadlines, things like that, and to open up the next module, which will be our last module, which is crazy. So thanks again for your work. Thanks so much for all you've done so far this semester. It's been a real joy to get to this stage with you all. So let's end strongly. I know it's hard work, but it's only hard work for a few more days, really. Good luck, everyone.